We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes.
Ruth Vanita is Professor of Liberal Studies and Women's Studies at the University of Montana, where she teaches courses in the Humanities and Literature, Women's Studies, and Gender and Sexuality. She was formerly a reader in English at Miranda House and the English Department in Delhi University. She received her PhD in 1992 in English at Delhi University. From 1979 through 1990, Ruth was active in the women's movement in Delhi. As one of the founding co-editors of Manushi, India's first feminist journal, she traveled to various cities, towns, and villages where she worked with women's groups conducting research on issues such as women's inheritance and land rights, marriage and dowry practices, and wife battering and murder. Ruth was also active in movements against communal violence. She participated in Nagrik Ekta Manch's work with victims of the 1984 anti-Sikh riots in Delhi, and was a member of a Manushi team that conducted a survey of and wrote a report on the Hindu-Muslim riots in Meerut in 1987. In 1991, she worked for the peaceful resolution of anti-reservation riots in Delhi. Vanita is the author of several books. In 1984, she co-edited with Madhu Kishwar In Search of Answers, Indian Women's Voices from Manushi, which was a collection of articles, letters, and editorials from the first 5 years of the magazine's history. Sappho and the Virgin Mary, Same-Sex Love, and the English Literary Imagination was published in 1996. In 2000, she co-edited with Salim Kidwai a foundational text in Indian lesbian and gay studies, which covered writings on same-sex love from over 2,000 years of Indian literature. And she recently edited Queering India, Same-Sex Love and Eroticism in Indian Culture and Society, which examines a wide range of sources from film, literature, popular culture, historical and religious texts, and the law, and covers a broad sweep of history from the age of the Kama Sutra in the 4th century AD to the 1998 film Fire. Ruth is a published poet and has a collection of poems entitled A Play of Light. She's also translated many poems, short stories, and articles for Manushi's Hindi and English editions, and has published English translations of contemporary Hindi novelists Rajendra Yadav and Manu Bhandari, and of the Rajasthani fiction writer Vijay Dandeta. Hi, I'm Jayati Lal, and we're here in Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan with Ruth Vanita. First, I just want to thank you for agreeing to be interviewed for the Global Feminism Project, Ruth, and to welcome you to Ann Arbor.
Hi.
Well, what we want to do today is basically talk for about an hour and a half about your work, starting with the history of your engagement with the women's movement in India, and bringing it up to the current with the kinds of projects and work that you're involved in today. And I'd like to start first with some personal questions about your background and your history. Where were you born? Where did you go to school? Where did you grow up?
I was born in Burma, and my family moved to India when I was about 2. And I did primary and middle school at Springdale. Then my mother homeschooled me through high school. And then I went to Miranda House College for Women at Delhi University.
So how long were you homeschooled?
About 2-3 years. Yeah.
That's when high school?
Yeah.
And so you took your board exams?
Privately.
Privately.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. So your family is, in terms of religious background, could you talk about that?
My family is Christian, of a very Puritan dissenting kind of sect. I'm now practicing Hindu, philosophically Hindu, but I'm influenced by Christianity. As Ashish Nandi says, you can belong to more than one community. I think I'm like that.
So what sect, when you say that they were?
It's something like the Plymouth Brethren. They don't have a name, but.
And from both parents' side?
Really from my mother's side, but my father joined that group.
So growing up, were you speaking English at home?
Yeah, we were speaking English at home. My father's from South India, my mother's from the North, and we were speaking English.
So people don't tend to often realize that this sort of bilingualism often creates English as a a language that you speak at home. So how is it then, and when did your interest and expertise in Hindi grow? Because you speak not just Hindi, but Sanskrit very fluently to the extent that you actually do, well, translation work.
Well, Hindi is a second language at schools. We learned it that way, but I just was more immersed in it than many kids are. And then in the BA, I took Hindi as a full-fledged language. I did the BA pass. And then with Manushi, I did a lot of translation to and from Hindi to English. And then more recently, I've learned Urdu, and now I've taken 2 years of Sanskrit. So it's just my own self-education, partly.
So what was it like going from being homeschooled for your higher secondary, then to move to Delhi University, to Miranda House in the 1970s?
Well, it is a women's college, and it was very active. There was a lot of student activism, anti-beauty contest, all kinds of things like that. So I was on the fringes of that, but not very active in it. But I had close friends who were active in it. So it exposed me to Marxism. I became a Marxist. Exposed me to different kinds of reading and thinking and so on.
So you went from then finishing your master's degree, or finished your bachelor's degree, and then you went straight to working for Manushi, or were you in your master's program when you?
No, I had just finished the MA, and I started teaching at Miranda House in '76. And I met Madhu in '77, and we started a women's group which used to meet in my dorm room in Miranda House. And then about 7-8 months later, we began to work on Manushi, and the first issue came out in '79, January. So I was simultaneously teaching in Miranda House, which was my paid job, and working at Manushi, which was more than full-time as well.
So you finished, though, there was a period where after perhaps your master's and you took a hiatus from academia and went full-time into Manushi work?
No, I always taught at Miranda House. Manushi work was unpaid. So I taught at Miranda House throughout that period, from 1976. For 20 years, I taught Miranda House in Delhi University. But technically, I was an academic, but I wasn't doing much research. I'd started my PhD in 1976-77, but I stopped doing it. Then I did law school for about a year, and I just couldn't do all of that, so I stopped doing it. So I didn't do much research or academic writing. I did a little, but not much, because I was spending most of my energy on Manushi.
So Manushi was taking a lot of your time.
Right.
And when did you come to the US? I'm sort of first trying to get a broad sense of what the time phases were, and then we can go back into detail into the various sort of stages here.
93, I came for a conference. 94, 95, I spent at Cornell. And then 97, I moved for the job at Montana.
So what led to that decision? A lot of Indian academics in the US often come after or come for graduate studies and then end up staying here to teach. For you, it was somewhat different.
Yeah, I could have come at that time. I probably would have, but I got involved in Manushi and in activism, and so I just got totally absorbed there, and I didn't come to the US. I could easily have come immediately after the MA.
And how do you think that sort of changed your life trajectory? Does it, the work that you've done, because the time that you spent with Manushi was significant?
Yeah, I think I learned a tremendous amount from working at Manushi. I interacted with a huge spectrum of people, from like printers and bookbinders in Old Delhi to village and slum women, to politicians, to women writers, to a whole range of people whom I would never, as a middle-class girl, have met this range of people. And I learned a lot of skills like proofreading and typing and editing and interviewing people, and just a whole range of things which I wouldn't have learned. I improved my skills in Hindi and in understanding India, I think, Indian society and culture. And I think my work even on same-sex love in India wouldn't have had the depth that it does if I had moved as a young person.
That's interesting. So you've mentioned already that you had started a group along with Madhu Kishwar, who was your co-founder, Manushi, while you were still in Miranda House. And the name of the group was Adhikar Manch, right? Forum for the Rights of Women. Could you talk a little bit about that, what you did? Because this was still, while you were in college, it was based in Miranda House?
I was just teaching. I started teaching in '76 in the same college where I was educated. It met in my dorm room, and we basically read the foundational texts of feminism, Simone de Beauvoir, Frederick Engels, Kate Millett, and we had Florence Howe. She happened to be visiting. We had various people come and talk to us, Veena Majumdar, Florence Howe. And when Florence described the American women's movement, I remember she mentioned the lesbian wing of it, and it was like a light bulb going off in my head, because I thought then that's the name for what I feel, and that's what it is. And we did a survey of women's and men's dorms on the campus to show the differences in conditions and in rules and things like that. And then we got the idea of doing Manushi, and that group kind of died, because then we went ahead and worked on Manushi.
And basically took it outside the university.
Yeah, yeah.
So in a sense, if there were role models, or if I were to ask you what was their particular experience or set of experiences that led you to start that women's group that then ends up becoming Manushi, what would you say it was? You talk about a light bulb moment, which is often the same way it's talked about in the the aha moment. So you had already sort of had feelings of being different in terms of your sexuality, and then sort of had a name for it?
Yeah, I had been in love with a woman when I was in the MA, but I just couldn't see it going anywhere. I wrote poems about it and stuff, so I had language for it, but I didn't have a name or a category. I couldn't see it moving towards a lifelong thing, so I still thought I would get married to a man. And so having a word and knowing that there are other people like that made a huge difference. In terms of influences, I saw myself as a Marxist at that time, which I, of course, later changed. So I wanted to do something. As a Marxist, I wanted to do something, and what Madhu suggested was starting a women's group, which was not what I would have done. I was more interested in working in a trade union or something. And then by reading these texts like Engels and de Beauvoir and so on, I began to see the point of that.
So you spoke a little bit about the kinds of texts that you read in this group, which is an interesting mix, right, of sort of Marxist analysis. I don't think many groups in the US would sort of read Engels as an avenue into feminism. Does that speak to the political climate at the time in the 1970s in India, or the sphere of sort of activism and politics in Delhi? It was also a very important moment about the post-emergency. Could you talk about that and how that might have affected your consciousness and the group that you were in Miranda House?
Yeah, in that post-emergency period, a number of small, since the press had been shut down during the emergency.
Could you talk a little bit about what the emergency was and when?
It was something imposed by Indira Gandhi, where she shut down lots of civil liberties, and the freedom of the press was one of them. And so in the post-emergency period, a lot of small magazines and newspapers cropped up. Manushi was one of those, and there's a whole range of them. Like my uncle edited one called Hamlet Studies for many years, which is the only journal on Hamlet. And even that, he has seen it as a sort of the individual voice speaking. And I think Manushi was one of those. There was a whole ferment at the time.
So we've already started talking about Manushi, and I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about, just describe what it was, how it formed, what its intent was. It was both a journal and much more than a journal. What were your goals?
One goal was to put women's issues on the political agenda of every party. At that time, women's issues would appear as a sort of addendum in the manifesto way at the end of it. We wanted it to become a major political issue, I think, and we did help to do that. We wanted to change women's issues from being just, if you looked at women's pages of newspapers and magazines at the time, they were just about beauty and cookery and things. And we wanted to bring in the issues of women's lives, material issues of women's lives, by having women speak, women who speak and write about their lives and their issues in Manushi. And I think Manushi had a huge effect in transforming mainstream media and women's media, because now you can publish on, say, violence or sexuality or anything in any Indian newspaper or magazine. If you look at Femina and Eve's Weekly, they've really changed. And that is in response to things like Manushi. And now it paradoxically meant that a lot of women who did publish in Manushi now don't need to anymore, because now they can publish in the mainstream media. And so Manushi served a certain purpose at a certain time, and I think now doesn't have that key role that it had at the time.
Could you tell me what Manushi means and why you chose the name?
It comes from Manush, which means human being in Sanskrit and Sanskrit-based languages, but it's masculine, it's gendered masculine, so by adding the E, it becomes the female human being, but the female human being. And it is a word, but not a much used word. It exists in dictionaries, but it's not much used, and so it was seen as a sort of coinage, though it really wasn't an invention.
So, so it has a very powerful influence, a long-lasting influence in changing the kind of the public sphere, really. But at the time, would you say that Manushi sort of marked a moment in the Indian feminist movement, really the rise of, or the birth of what's been called variously the autonomous women's movement or the independent women's movement? And who were your contemporaries at the time in terms of other organizations doing similar kinds of work?
There were the women's wings of all the political parties, and there were social work type, charitable type women's organizations like the Lions Club and the ladies' wing of it, which did social, educational, charitable work. with a lot of overlap with some of what the women's groups did. And then soon after Manushi, or almost at the same time, there were things like the FAOW in Bombay, there was Saheli, there were other groups in other parts of the country.
So would you say, though, that this was a moment that you were sort of doing something that hadn't been done before, or would you say that in some ways you've talked about how there are always, or there have been antecedents to this sort of work in terms of raising women's issues in the Arya Samaj and other
Yeah,
groups?
there are always antecedents. I won't say that anything is entirely new, but it was a new form and that the movement was taking. There were in the 19th and early 20th centuries, there were the social reform movements, which concentrated on many of the same women's issues that the present movement does: dowry, violence, wife beating, etc., education, women's education, and had some pretty amazing women activists who remained single, who traveled across the world speaking and so on. So there's a lot of history that we didn't know about, but later came to know about.
So how did this complicate the work of Manushi at the time? Here you are, a young organization, young in the sense of new, and you are entering a field that's already occupied, as you said, primarily by political parties. So could you kind of describe some of the work that you were trying to do in those early years, and how your engagements with other people who were sort of doing women's issues was either complicated or not?
Well, we intended just to bring out a magazine, and we didn't know what that involved. We knew nothing about bringing it out. It turned out to be a tremendous task, just the mechanics of bringing it out with the kind of technology that was available to us, which was very low-grade technology, manual typewriters and manual printing presses and things like that. But the minute that the first issue came out and we had this little office that was also our home, we were flooded with women coming with basically with stories about domestic violence and wanting help, and also with volunteers and people who just wanted information, and tourists, including foreign tourists, coming in to talk about the women's movement. So we just had to deal with a whole range of things. We set up a legal advice cell. We started taking down the stories of women and trying to help them out with their legal cases or negotiating with their families. And then we got suddenly a lot of contacts with activists all over the country in small towns and villages, many of them men. They weren't just women. There were many of them men working on women's issues or interested in working on them, who said, well, give me 10 copies of Manushi, I'll sell it here, but this is our story of our organization and we are trying to do some of these issues. So we got in contact with a huge network of activists all over the country who had very different political leanings, from Gandhian to socialist to different kinds of leftist, Maoist, etc. It varied. It was a big range.
You end up becoming not just a magazine, but in some ways functioning as a crisis center, legal aid center, and also sounds like you become a node for a network, that you were sort of in some ways facilitating the formation of a network across a spectrum of parties around gender issues. How did at that time, how did issues of gender, caste, culture, and language impact the women's movement in India, or maybe even specifically in Delhi, or you could talk about it in terms of Manushi in particular? That is, there are so many deep differences inherent in Indian culture, right? So how did Manushi see itself positioning itself vis-a-vis, one notable feature is you're bilingual, so it was English and Hindi edition, which was a significant decision and quite hard to do, right?
It was very hard. It involved a lot of translation, primarily from English to Hindi, because most of the writing that came in was in English. And when we did interviews of Hindi-speaking women, then we would transcribe it in Hindi or tape record it in Hindi and transcribe it. Some writing did come in Hindi, but most of it was in English, so then we had a full-time job of translating that into Hindi and publishing that. And then Hindi is only spoken in certain parts of the country, so of course there were requests from other places, bring it out in Tamil, bring it out in this and that, which we were not at all equipped to do. But one thing that did happen is that groups or activists in other parts of the country, if they liked a particular article or essay, they would translate it into their local language and print it as a newsletter, pamphlet, put it in the local press, whatever. And sometimes we would come to know about this use, sometimes we wouldn't. And that was fine, because it was disseminating the ideas. It wasn't like they wanted to keep all the copyright or anything.
So Manushi says even today on the website that they work from a people-oriented perspective, and it also attempts to bridge the academic-scholar divide. So how do you think that actually worked? I mean, literacy in India is so low, right? Literacy rate. So who do you think the audience really ends up being, and how does the magazine travel, and how does it reach? How does it become a people? How does it get to the people?
Well, the primary audience is, of course, the literate. And then how does it get disseminated? If these people who are reading it, many of them were social workers, activists, local teachers, school teachers, whatever, then if they disseminate the ideas through their work and the people that they are working with. and they implement it in their activism. They communicate with each other. So in that way, in terms of the academic scholar, the scholar and activist divide, yeah, and many times, like if we found the writings like of some major scholar really interesting, but it's written in a kind of language that's too difficult for a regular housewife or somebody to understand. And many times I have taken those articles, and I was the one who did a lot of this, and rewrote it in simpler language, then showed it to that person, and if it was okay with them, we published it in that simpler sort of format. We did a lot of that.
And you also had conscious economic decisions, both in terms of pricing and where you got your funding from.
Yeah, we decided at the start we took advertisements, and these advertisements were basically got from friends and acquaintances and family members, somebody with a tire business and somebody with a bookshop. We'd get ads from them. They weren't going to get anything out of it. It was like a donation. And we collected subscriptions and individual donations, which ran out very fast because we had collected too little. We had underestimated the price and the value of. So then after about 4 issues, we decided to stop taking advertisements because there was too much energy being expended finding them and not bringing in much money. And we wouldn't take a certain kind of advertisement, obviously. So then we just decided to raise the foreign subscription really high. And then we got a lot of foreign libraries and individuals subscribing, donating, and so on. So I think basically what happened was that the foreign and the library subscriptions subsidized the individual Indian subscriptions, and then the English edition totally subsidized the Hindi edition. That was how the economics of it were.
So how do you think, if you were to describe the readership of the magazine at the time, how would you describe it? What's the spectrum that you think you actually reached?
Lots of academics, and academics doesn't mean just in big universities. It's in small colleges in Haryana and Sagar University and Bengal, you know, small town colleges. Lots of, say, school teachers, social workers, political activists from right to left. I would say because it was a women's issue, it really does span that reach. We got opinions from sort of fairly right wing to fairly left wing and everything in between. And a lot of housewives and educated housewives and students. A lot of my students at Miranda House became volunteers as well as readers and distributors and things like that.
So could you describe some of the issues that Manushi was involved in and forced to become involved in when you are sort of almost treated as a legal aid center or as a crisis center, that ends up sort of becoming voiced also in the editorial positions that you take, because they were issues that were very salient at the time in the women's movement. Could you give me some examples of issues that really you think were defining both for that moment in Indian feminism, and I'm talking here, say, the early 80s or maybe through the 80s, because you were with Manushi till 1990.
Well, the Indian women's movement has, and I've written about this, has tended to focus very much on abuse and victimization and very little on pleasure and power and things like that. And in keeping with that, we focused on violence against women, on legal issues and legal rights, like not having certain legal rights, custody of children, wife beating, wife murder. Those were the issues being brought to us by women. And then a lot of poverty-related issues, women having to collect fuel and water and food and spend their lives and their time and energy on those things. Employment, migration within the country. Those were some of the issues.
Were there something defining at that moment that, you know, Manushi took a stance on that ended up becoming contentious either within the women's movement, or which you sort of initiated legal action on behalf of women who came to you, which also sort of spearheaded a movement or moment?
Wife murder was a big one, which used to be called, or still called, dowry death, which we later, Manushi later developed a perspective which has been written about, that it's not just dowry death, it's wife murder, which is very often for a whole range of reasons, including dowry but not restricted to dowry, which gets projected just as dowry death because that's how it's legally defined. But anyway, wife murder and the violence leading up to it, because every murder is always preceded by a whole cycle of wife battering and abuse. That was a big issue. Rape, to some extent, around the Mathura rape case was an issue for a while. And the women's movement in general pressured the government to make the laws more punitive on rape and on dowry, on what they called indecent representation of women in advertisements. In that case, Manushi took a stance, a sort of a more freedom of speech stance, against censoring all kinds of sexual materials, because that's a very harsh act. which censors all kinds of sexuality, nudity, etc., as pornographic, but allows, for instance, women to be shown as using detergents or being full-time housewives, because that's not indecent. And so we had some differences of opinion with other women's groups on that. Some of the laws that Manushi specifically filed cases to change were enabling laws like inheritance of land rights. And these laws have been changing slowly for women to inherit immovable property, which would really empower them to the point where they wouldn't need a dowry. Because a lot of women see themselves as needing dowry, that's the only form of inheritance they get. Especially we filed a case for tribal women's land rights. Tribal women do most of the work in the economy, but they don't own the land because the land is supposed to belong to the tribe. In effect, it belongs to the men. That was one case. Another case we filed was for guardianship of small children. And over the age of 5, the father was defined as a natural guardian in Hindu law. And so we filed a case on behalf of a woman who had 2 kids whose custody was disputed.
So when you say filed cases, this is to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, these are public interest litigation cases in the Supreme Court, citing the one case but claiming that it affects a whole group of people.
So where do you get the legal expertise? Your people who bring out a magazine. How does
we had lots
Manushi
of people offering aid. We had lots of volunteers coming in and out, coming and going, and not just Indian, also foreign, who used to come and work for 3 months, for 6 months, for 2 weeks, for 1 week, like that. We had 2 lawyers who came in, 2 women lawyers who came and offered to run a legal cell for us, and they helped us a lot. Plus, we took advice. We would just go and consult any major lawyer, women and men, and they were all very open to helping and to giving advice, to helping draw up briefs, etc. But we had these 2 women who primarily helped run the legal cell or gave advice.
So you said, you specifically mentioned like the tribal land rights and guardianship of children. Where are these cases now? Do you know? Are they still? Because
I know that they took years in court, and after I left Manushi recently, I read about them. I think that both. The tribal land rights case was definitely lost because it involves the rights of the tribe, and they don't want to turn it into individual property rights, even though in the way it actually functions, it means that the men end up mortgaging the land and basically selling it. And the custody case, I think, was also lost in the form in which it was filed. It was lost. Though those laws are being modified otherwise by the legislature, but it was lost in court, I think.
So you call these issues that you've pursued legally as an attempt to get enabling laws set into place. And you're contrasting these with more punitive laws. So is the issue of dowry debts or domestic violence one of the categories in which you would say that punitive laws have been sought by the Indian movement? Could you talk about your analysis of that?
It's very complicated, and it's been written about in Manushi, and elsewhere as well. There's a book by Veena Oldenburg called Dowry Murder, which lays out the issues quite well. But basically what the Indian women's movement did was to raise the punishment for giving and taking dowry, so more and more years of imprisonment and so on, which had no effect because 99% of Indians, including the lawmakers and the police, do give and take dowry. And what happens is, when they're giving and taking it at the time of the marriage, they say this is just what we want to give. It's voluntary, which is allowed. And then when if they later have a fight with this conflict in the family, then they redefine it with hindsight as dowry,
right?
Which is very convenient. And that's one thing. The other kind of punitive law was to say that just on the women's say-so, if the woman just says, they harassed me or abused me, and abuse is very wide, it includes mental and emotional abuse, you can arrest not only the man, but his mother, his father, his whole family, and put them into prison without any other evidence except the woman's statement, and they have to then, the onus of proof is shifted onto them, which is never the case. They're not innocent till proved guilty, they're guilty till they prove their innocence, and this is a very, very stringent law, and many people have written about how much it has been misused. There's no systematic statistics, but it really, we know from cases, most women's groups would tell you that it's been misused quite a bit. They might differ on the degree to which it's been misused, but that it is misused and it's open to abuse is definitely the
So
case.
what would the alternative be? Because at the same time, it's also possible that it's helped a lot of women. Like things like the rules for evidence were changed, right? So you can take a dying declarations, which wasn't possible previously, especially in the case of dowry debts and burnings. So what other alternative would there be?
Well, the other alternative, which Manushi suggested, and now later many academics like Beena Agarwal have also suggested, is inheritance rights, that women will continue to want dowry. And many of my students whom I asked to write essays on dowry said, yes, I will take it. Why should I not take it when my brothers are going to inherit the land, the house, and everything, and this is the little bit I can get? Why should I give it up and marry without a dowry, which was what we had been advocating. The only way to end dowry really is to make inheritance absolutely equal, and also to empower women and give them agency and mobility, so that they are able to, so that before before it comes to a murder, she's able to actually leave and live independently, which is extremely difficult for many women to live alone. So they have to go back to the father or the brothers who send them back to the husband. So unless you break that cycle, and this involves not just employment, because so many of the women who've been killed have been doctors, engineers, and so, but it involves housing, making housing, mobility, and agency, basically.
So then you would,
larger tasks than just changing a law.
Right. You would then extend that analysis to domestic violence in general, not just dowry deaths.
And I think it applies to any country, to any group of women in any country. In the US, if fewer, I think wife battering is very widespread, but if fewer women end up dead, it's because they're able to leave and find a place to live. At least some of them are. And even here we know how difficult it is from the refugees, refugees, they go back home very often, right?
So these sorts of issues, so just a small glimpse, give a sense of the way in which you may have been positioned differently vis-a-vis other groups, women's groups, in terms of your analysis of very difficult issues that were facing the movement at the time, such as dowry deaths. So how would you characterize, if you think it's possible, or could you speak to what Manushi's relationship was at that time that you were with it, to other women's groups and organizations in Delhi? In a sense, how would you position Manushi vis-a-vis the women's movement more broadly?
We did a lot of joint actions, particularly like International Women's Day marches and protest demonstrations against the police and particular harassment cases, or against families in particular. So we did a lot of joint actions. We had some differences of opinion on issues like, as I said, the Indecent Representation of Women Act, and or whether one was under the irretrievable breakdown of marriage, whether if one party feels that the marriage has broken down completely, should they be able to get out of it or not? And in India, you cannot. Unless both the parties agree, you can't get out of it. So we know women who've been 17 years married to one man living with another, but cannot get out of it because he doesn't let you divorce him. So we thought that that should be possible. Many of the women's groups thought it would be used against women by men, and therefore it shouldn't be possible. So we had differences of opinion of that type, and we sometimes published different points of view in Manushi on some of these issues. There were also lots of personality conflicts and political differences, as well as personality conflicts not just between Manushi and other groups, but between other groups too. So I think the movement's I think like most movements, is pretty fraught.
How would you describe Manushi? Would you describe Manushi as a feminist magazine, and why? Or why not? I mean, and I ask this particularly because, of course, we know that Madhu at least has come out in her 1990 article, which is entitled "Why I Do Not Call Myself a Feminist," and she's sort of against isms in general. But if you think about the work of Manushi and reflect on that, would you say it was a feminist organization, and why?
It's a question of how you use language, and when Madhu wrote that article, it went through many drafts that I commented on in detail, and she did change it, but I still deferred with her on it, because language cannot be controlled by individuals. So even if Manushi was never called a feminist magazine, we never said a journal about women and society, but it was called feminist by others, and I think in common understanding it is feminist. And so it's useless to keep saying I'm not. If other people are going to call you that and your work is that, it is feminist in effect, because language can't be controlled by you, it's in social circulation. So to that extent, yes, I would say it is feminist.
And yet you've described an organization that was very flexible and not dogmatic at all, in terms of the way you both represent in your editorials and represent a spectrum of positions.
I wouldn't say that entirely. It wasn't always the case. Like, it depends on the issue. But on certain issues, Manushi would now especially, it takes very clear-cut positions, say for reservations for women, but for reservations for other backward castes. So if you had an anti-reservation for the backward caste position, they wouldn't publish that. So it takes pretty clear positions too on several issues.
So you started working on your PhD while you were at Manushi. And at that point also you switched to, you leave Manushi about the same time. So was the appeal of academia as a sort of statement about your disenchantment with the work that you had been doing, with activism in general, with Manushi in particular, with the women's movement at the time? What sort of issues, or what was missing in the work that you were doing at Manushi that led you to sort of decide to go back to academia and pursue a PhD?
Yeah, I would say two things were missing. One was sexuality, and the other was depth. when you're writing a magazine that is for a general audience, it was not an academic journal, you're writing for a general audience. The women's movement in general tends to always simplify and sort of talk down. It's run by middle and upper class women mainly, at least in the big cities. And it's never about their own issues. It's almost about the issues of victimized women. And if, for instance, lesbianism was, I now know that many of the leaders of those autonomous women's groups were either lesbian or bisexual and were actively talking about it among themselves. But in the public, when we came together as groups, we would never talk about it. One conference that we went to in 1980, there was a woman, an Indian woman from England visiting, and she was an open lesbian, the only out one. And I went and came out to her, and she told me that any number of women had come out to her because she was a safe person going back to England, but had not talked to each other. And that has still not been acknowledged, the amount of lesbian energy that went into the movement in the 70s and 80s. And now in the 90s it began to be acknowledged, and now some of the groups are talking about it. But at the time it was very shut down. It was very afraid of being labeled lesbian and therefore westernized and so on. So there was a very limited amount of writing about sexual issues that we could do in Manushi. It was seen as a self-indulgent thing that the West does. And this is not just Manushi, but the women's movement in general. And that's not an important issue for Indian women who are dying of malnutrition or amniocentesis or whatever. And so we don't have the luxury to think about sexuality. And I found that very constraining because I had to sort of, I didn't come out for various reasons, but this was definitely one of them, that my persona was tied up with that of Manushi, and so it would label Manushi. And that was the fear, at least. I don't know if it would have. But and relatively, academia was a freer space, even in India. Whatever I published very early while I was working at Manushi, an article on the female-female relationship and As You Like It, and was very well received in Delhi University by my teachers, who were just regular, good old liberal people. They were not feminist or Marxist or anything. And they received my book very well. So I felt much freer. There was paradoxically a kind of liberation there. And the second thing was that the kind of writing and research done at Manushi it didn't allow for depth. Just in terms of time and energy, I had no time to learn a language, no time to really read very much. There's always a sort of reaction to the issues of the moment. And whatever depth there was through interviewing somebody, that we would interview people in depth. But that's limited. There was, in terms of looking at the past, we did one issue on women Bhakta poets, the 10th anniversary issue, and that was one of the most satisfying things I did, because I read a lot of poetry written by medieval women poets and wrote about it. And but it was, again, we had to go on to the next issue and the next issue of the magazine. So one couldn't spend months, years, or even months researching one thing and finding out its roots. And I just, after 13 years of doing Manushi, I just needed that different kind of intellectual satisfaction and emotional. So.
Yeah, thank you. So you end up going to the academy, and we'll talk about your academic work in a little bit, but I also want to sort of ask you the question I've asked you about Manushi more directly, and that is, how do you understand the term feminism? And what has it meant to your own work?
Like a lot of terms, it's kind of, well, unlike, say, Marxism or Gandhianism, where there is a set of texts and there is a minimal position you can say all Marxists have to take, or all Christians have to take, let's say. But it's not the case with feminism, because you can think that women should stay home and be good mothers and should be rewarded and acknowledged for that, and you could think that women should be presidents, or you can think you can be against abortion or for it, and you still call yourself a feminist. So it really is whatever you make of it, and whatever, if you say you're a feminist, you are, and other people may say you're not. So it's a completely open and completely contestable term. And to that extent, I don't find it very useful. I don't use it in my writing or anything. But definitely I am a feminist. I would be seen as a feminist. I wouldn't say no, I'm not, because I'm working on issues of women and gender and sexuality. That's most of my work has been on that. So it'd be kind of silly to say that I'm not.
Right. So you're right. It's a very difficult term to pin down when a wide spectrum of people from varied political backgrounds want to claim it. But maybe one way to sort of think, I'm trying to think about you in relationship to your work. How has it influenced your work? Do you see sort of feminism either as a politics or as a genre, as a sort of intellectual body of thinking, that it really deeply influences the way you think about the work that you're doing?
Yes, it definitely does, because once you start noticing gender and sexuality, then you see it everywhere. Whether I was teaching Shelley or whether I was reading the newspaper or talking to my students, I just see the impact of gender everywhere, the impact of sexuality and of gender everywhere. So then it just enters your discourse, and once it's entered, you can't get it out again. Once you've opened it up, you just see it everywhere in things you may not have noticed otherwise. So to that extent, yeah.
So you've said that others may call you a feminist, but would you call yourself a feminist?
I've never had occasion to. I mean, I wouldn't say I'm a feminist. Why would I? Because I'm just talking about issues.
Earlier in the interview, you claimed a label that I was a little surprised about. You said I was a Marxist. So if you were to sort of give yourself a label, and we know how problematic labels are, either politically or in terms of what you think to be most central to your politics at this time, how would you describe yourself?
I would say I'm influenced by many things. You know, I've been influenced by Marxism, certainly, by anarchism, certainly, by feminism, I am a lesbian, and I'm influenced by Christianity, by Hinduism. So I'm influenced by Gandhi's writings, influenced by a range of things. I wouldn't say that I'm just Gandhian, even though I agree with many things he says, I disagree with many others. So, you know.
So you don't want to be pinned down. You've talked about your lesbianism, and could you tell me more, like, what is the genealogy of your coming out in relationship to the work that you were doing, or is this something that happened much later? What about your family?
Yeah, I came out to my mother in about 1985, and we had a discussion about it, which was fairly calm. But then she sort of had an amnesia about it and seemed to have forgotten and had to be told several different times. And there have been various conflicts about it too, but now they've pretty much accepted it. I came out to Madhu, of course, and other colleagues at Manushi. Then I found a group of gay friends around the early 1989-90. I made a group of gay friends who were separate from Manushi, and I kept them entirely separate and lived this sort of two lives. I met my gay friends separately and did Manushi work separately. They were outside the women's movement, and so I came out to them in that sense. I've been corresponding with Ashok Rao Kavi of Bombay Dost for a long time. I was reading Bombay Dost while I was at Manushi, and Trikon and all the lesbian stuff that came out of the US and was sent to India. I was reading that. I was collecting, while I was at Manushi, I was cutting out from newspapers and collecting every single thing that appeared on homosexuality. I was collecting books, and all of that went into same-sex love in India, all the collection that I had, and that Salim had been doing the same thing. So I had it on my mind a lot, and I was working on Virginia Woolf again on sexuality issues, so I was reading all of that. So I was doing a lot of reading, and through my academic work, I was, in a way, coming out to my colleagues at Delhi University, but in a way not, because later when I got married to a woman in 2000, some of them, though they had read all my work, claimed to be totally surprised. So they thought I was working on it, but perhaps wasn't living it or something. You know, so.
That's really a great commentary, both about the ways in which people just don't see what's in front of them when they don't want to. Also about the way in which, at that time, there was really not much of a field of gay lesbian activism in India. You've mentioned a couple of groups that were Bombay-based. Delhi, these groups hadn't really started. No. And this is really very striking about your work. Your academic work and writing has really been very much engaged with recovering the history of what you call the tolerance towards same-sex love in the Indian context, of a really broad historical sweep from ancient to medieval and onto modern texts and histories. And how does this focus on recovery, as you talked about the archive that you and Salim kept that ended up becoming the book, how does this link up with your work outside the academy? So do you see this sort of work that you're doing in producing these texts? Is it mostly archival? Is it academic? Is it an activist interest? Or is this where it all comes together?
Well, it's giving us back our history. Like when I was a student at Delhi University, we were taught, say, E.M. Foster and W.H. Auden with absolutely no gender sexuality reference. So we weren't made aware that say, Auden's love poems are to men. And if we had been made aware, then it wouldn't have made me feel that so isolated as the only one, sort of. And then when I did my work, my students came out to me at Delhi University. And now in many Delhi University colleges, they are organizing, they are talking about these issues, they are putting up exhibits and so on and so forth. So, you know, if you have no past, then I think you have no future. People that doesn't have a past doesn't have a future. And we were constantly told, there's this myth that homosexuality is an import either from West Asia or from Europe, which is entirely untrue, but we didn't have the evidence to show that it's untrue. So it's really important to present that evidence, and that's what Salim and I were trying to do.
In a sense, it's a really foundational text for Indian lesbian and gay studies. There was really nothing comparable at the time.
No, there were a couple of popular books, The World of Homosexuality by the mathematician Shakuntala Devi. popular book interviewing a couple of people and writing about the issues and the issue of civil rights and so on. There was a little report called Less Than Gay, brought out by ABVA, which is an anti-AIDS group, and that again was on the status of gay people at present in India. No, there were a few academic essays which were buried in journals here and there on very specific issues, like on pederastic love in Urdu literature or something like that, very specific, and not accessible to most people. So I think this book was intended, it does work as a resource because there's so much more research that can be done if you look at what's in the book. It's a gateway to a whole lot of material that's out there, I'm sure, in many of Indian languages.
You talked before to me about a group that you started after leaving Manushi that was linked more directly with archival work.
Yeah, a bunch of us started a group called DARE. It was Documentation, Archive, Research, Education, and it was intended to be like a resource, basically an archive of gay-related materials. And Salim and I would put our materials in that. But then I left the country and it sort of fell apart. There weren't too many people who could put it required a lot of time and energy to be put into it. And so nothing happened on that score. And then the gay movement took off, basically. Bombay Dost already was in existence, but all the other groups came into existence post the HIV/AIDS problem, and they got huge amounts of funding, foreign as well as governmental, to do that. And then those anti-AIDS groups became the spaces where gay issues could be talked about, basically. That gave the movement a big fillip. And there now are lesbian groups as well in Bombay and Delhi and Kerala and Madras and various places.
So how would you characterize the relationship or the response by the Indian women's movement and various women's groups that you were in contact with in Delhi when this activism starts coming into play in terms of sexuality?
Well, it has been very mixed and very up and down and back and forth. It's certainly now, after 10 years, or after the 90s, after 10 years or so, now there's, at least at the women's conferences, the big women's annual conferences, they'll have one workshop on lesbianism or on sexuality or something like that. There are some little groups, autonomous women's groups, funded groups, NGOs, who, like Tarshi and so on, which do sexuality workshops for rural women or for women in general. But the big women's groups, like the political parties' women's wings, are still in denial. For example, for the last few years and the March 8 International Women's Day marches, there has been this huge conflict that should the lesbian groups be allowed to march with banners that say lesbian on them as part of their name, or with shouting any slogans related to that. And the CPM Women's Wing, which brings a big contingent, absolutely said, no, it will scandalize our working class women and it will project the wrong image. So you can march as a group but not carry a banner that has any such word on it. Interestingly, the government-sponsored then women's exhibit on March 8 happily allowed them to have a booth with the name on it. So the debate is still going on, and within the CPM Women's Wing, I know there are many people who are for it, but they have to argue with the whole party hierarchy. There's still a tremendous distrust and fear, basically, of being labeled as anti-men, man-hating, and so on, which women's movement has generally dealt with in India right from the start. And lesbian just sort of adds to that, so they don't want that labeling. I wouldn't say they're very welcoming at all, but I think they're being pushed, especially now by younger women, and they're having to cede some space. So with the fire debate, for example, all the groups did come out in defense of the movie's right to be shown. So that was a good thing.
So it's a sort of two-pronged response on the part of the Marxist parties that it's not as important as issues of class, or it might alienate the working class.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then that sort of folds into a discourse also about it being Western, right? And this sort of leads into my other question. You've mentioned in your writing specific reasons for why you prefer to use the term lesbian gay studies rather than queer. Could you talk about that? And yet in your second book has queer in the title.
The second book is a collection of essays in which many writers were using the word queer, and that's the only title the publisher could come up with. I couldn't come up with anything else, so it was fine. In my own work, I don't use it because I think it's too broad a term. It could encompass everything from pedophilia to heterosexual sadomasochism to any kind of fetish and so on. It is not at all specific. And secondly, I don't like its negative connotation because it still very much has that, especially in India. And even here, I think it still hasn't lost its connotation of being really strange and weird. Like for my mother, for instance, for her to say queer and think of anything queer as positive would be extremely difficult, whereas gay at least sounds positive in terms of what it means in the language. And I like the history of lesbian too, connected to Lesbos and so on. Whereas queer has nothing positive about it that I can see, except what you put into it. But it has nothing in terms of the history or the cultural connotation, which you can't entirely shed. So that's the reason for that. Yeah.
Well, you've already mentioned the film Fire, and it really has been a very important sort of turning point in politics in the Indian context. In fact, in discussing the reception of Deepa Mehta's 1998 film Fire, you've said that you think that it really initiated the first public debate on homosexuality in India. And I'd like to quote from something that you've written. You've said that it's, and I quote, "It's impossible and entirely futile to separate the Western from the Eastern in the modern world and in modern India. This inseparability is demonstrated by the fact that all the Indian lesbians whose weddings have been reported, and this is in the press, so far are non-English speaking lower middle class women unconnected with the supposedly Western phenomenon of the feminist or gay movements in Indian cities." End quote. I wonder if you could elaborate for us on your assessment here and what it is that you're trying to sort of unpack, and both in your sort of discussion of Fire, and if you could lay out for us why that was so significant in terms of the responses to it and the debate that followed.
Well, I've argued in many different essays that ideas circulate, and even in the pre-modern past, from the ancient to the present, ideas have been circulating between so-called East and so-called West, depending on where you draw those lines. Anyway, they're arbitrary. Ideas have been circulating. An example would be Thoreau and Emerson and so on, who read the Bhagavad Gita, and it shapes their transcendentalism. Then Gandhi reads Thoreau and is highly influenced by him. Then Martin Luther King reads Gandhi and is influenced by him. So these are circulations, and they're good. Circulation is a good thing, and whether it's a good or bad thing, you can't stop it. So to kind of be this post-colonialist anxiety about shutting out everything Western is unrealistic. It can't be done. I can't shut out all the Western influences from my family, from my reading, from my education, etc., without killing myself. I can't do it. So it's a silly idea to think that just removing, not using the word feminism or not using the word lesbian will somehow make me more indigenous or more Indian or whatever that is. And Indian culture particularly has been so assimilative. It's assimilated every culture from around the world. Why shouldn't it assimilate present-day modern influences too? And I think from a position of, I have a feeling of more confidence about Indian culture and its ability to retain its own selfhood, whatever that is, while absorbing Western influences. And I can see that even in things like McDonald's in India is a very different thing from McDonald's here. It has a sign saying no beef and pork served on these premises, and it has 10 vegetarian offerings. So it has become something different, which I think it hasn't necessarily in every country that it has gone to. It's in India that this significant change occurs. And in terms of Fire, one of the main criticisms of Fire, even by Madhu Kishwa and Manushi and by many people, was that it's a Western view because she lives in Canada. And so you're kind of damned if you live somewhere else, though she was brought up in Delhi and she's entirely Indian. I think that's a sort of not a very useful criticism to make, because the point is the text useful?
Right.
Where she lives is kind of irrelevant to me. And there's a basic heterosexism and defensiveness about sexual issues, which then is expressed in the whole question of Westernization, because I went to a feminist retreat in India in around 2001, and some very prominent feminist academics there, including historians, were basically saying, okay, I was presenting same-sex love in India materials, and they were saying, well, what's the use of talking about same-sex love in the past in India? This might only strengthen the Hindu right if you say good things about Hindu texts. And anyway, what's the use? Talk about civil rights now if you want to, but what's the use of talking about the past? Which is a strange thing for a historian to say. And they certainly wouldn't say it if you were writing about the family or marriage. Also, the kind of thing of don't use terms like lesbian and gay because they're Western terms. But what about using terms like family and marriage and man and woman?
Right.
Now, the Hindi equivalents of these or the Sanskrit equivalents of these are not exactly the same thing. When you say parivara and you translate that as family, it's not exactly the same thing, but we do it. It's not possible to use a language. I mean, we'd have to stop using English entirely. And even then, Hindi has absorbed a lot of English words, like television. Now, if you say Doordarshan, Doorbin, invent some word, it still doesn't mean that it's entirely non-Western. Parliamentary democracy is Western, Marxism is Western. So it's a little funny to get so anxious about the Western when it comes to feminism or homosexuality, and homosexuality in particular, which is not Western at all, I mean, in its practice. The weddings you were talking about,
and
have been a series of weddings over the last 2 decades in India, in various different parts of India, between lower middle class, mostly Hindu women, some of them conducted by Hindu priests with family support. And that's one of the things that I'm writing about in the current book, which is called Love's Right, R-I-T-E.
Yes, I'm sorry, I mispronounced that.
That's okay, and sort of a play on the word, and it's from Shakespeare's sonnet, The Perfect Ceremony of Love's Right. And so that's interesting that the idea of marrying one another occurs to these women, and that it's accepted by their local communities, even though it's not legal. And that the same idea occurs to people here, because it seems to me that I know universal is a very bad word, but is now an unfashionable word, but falling in love and wanting to make a public commitment and a sanctified commitment is something fairly cross-cultural, and it doesn't have to be imported from one place to another. It's what occurs to people to do. And it has antecedents in Indian texts, which are marriage-like unions, and it has antecedents in European texts too, which many scholars have shown. So I'm interested in these similarities and connections, and not just in emphasizing only the differences.
So if I were to take the standpoint of this Marxist or, you know, some political party women's wing person and say, well, these marriages, these same-sex marriages that are talked about in the Indian press of these lower middle class women, Hindi-speaking women, aren't really lesbian relationships. They're just sort of, they're a critique of patriarchy and an escape from patriarchy. And so that the sanction that they get from their family isn't really the sanction of sort of knowing it, or it doesn't articulate it as romantic or sexual love. How would you respond to that?
Well, I would respond by saying that the newspaper reports, when they actually interview these women, the women very clearly say, I love her and I fell in love with her and I want to live with her. So they are using the word love, and love at least is a word that translates fairly easily. Now, they are not using the word lesbian for themselves, but it's like Madhu saying she's not a feminist. You know, it's the word that if you're going to speak English, that's the word you would use. If it's the word that you're going to speak Hindi, then you say, I love her and I want to marry her. And that's enough. That communicates the message. You don't need to say lesbian. But there's no harm in saying lesbian if I'm writing about it in English. That's what I think. And it's like me before I had the word lesbian, but when I found the word lesbian in English, I wouldn't say, no, I won't use it because it's an English word, when I'm using every other word in English, you know. So I don't see this as a, it's not to me a major issue.
You've also noted that in your writing that a lot of these photographs note or show one person dressed more masculine, right, in the couple. Which also speaks to more than just sort of, you know, two people trying to sort of escape from patriarchal unions. I want to shift gears now and ask you to talk about more your creative writing. I mean, one of the things that's absolutely fascinating about your work, Ruth, is that it spans such an amazing spectrum, you know, from translation, which you do a lot of, from regional, but mostly Hindi to English and back, to academic, but also your creative writing. And I wonder if you could read for us a couple of poems. And I was going through your poetry, and even there's this amazing spectrum of the kind of issues that you deal with, but from very political reference and events to more romantic, sort of inward-looking romantic poetry, love poetry. And when did you first start writing poetry? I wondered if you could tell us about that.
I started very young, early teens maybe, very young. But I've stopped now, which is interesting. And most of these poems were written as a part of a huge body of poetry that I just wrote between, say, 1990 and 93. After I left Manushi, it was like this late blooming and dealing with personal life, which I'd kind of shut down for the years I was at Manushi. So that's the book that came out of that period. And then after 94, 95, I basically stopped writing poetry. I don't write anymore.
So that's interesting. Yeah. So when you wrote in English?
Yeah.
Yeah, always in English. Could you read a couple of poems for us? I was wondering if you could maybe read something that was more political and tell us about them, what the reference are and what the meaning is.
Okay, so this poem was in 1990. I had just left Manushi. I was in the process of leaving, actually, and there were the anti-reservation riots. Reservations had always existed in education and employment for the so-called scheduled caste, the so-called untouchable people. 25% existed for them. And then there was a move to extend that to other so-called other backward castes who were not necessarily economically, but they were culturally seen as underprivileged, and to increase the amount of reservations. So then the other castes who were not backward saw themselves as being really discriminated against and excluded from employment and education. And a lot of my students were very active in these movements, and a lot of young people, boys and girls, burnt themselves to death in public. And I felt that the political response was very inadequate. The left that thought that this was a kind of pathology and was very unsympathetic to these suicides, and the right was just making use of them and saying, oh, see, they're burning themselves to death, so you have to do something. But there was just an absolute lack of compassion or heart about so many young people burning themselves to death. There's something very serious about that, so it was in response to that. And it's called Mahabharata, Delhi, September 1990. Winter begins and men in uniform have taken over the streets. Somewhere behind high walls and TV screens, battalions in the heads of leaders form, ready to fire. Somewhere they shake hands and smile and mouth the words that are required. But here the children make a date with death and shed their flowers at obdurate feet, invoke a charm that makes for no exit and find themselves besieged. In either camp, the fathers calculate a kingdom's price. Who would not hold cheap for such a prize, honor and even blood? Who count the cost of Abhimanyu's feet? That's a reference to the Prince Abhimanyu, the very young boy who is used by by the patriarchs in the Mahabharata to fight a very difficult moment in the battle, and they know he's going to be killed, and they sacrifice him, and he dies fighting this formation.
So, did you publish, say, for example, this piece in Manushi or in a at the time?
Actually, I sent it to Manushi, and they refused to publish because they were taking a pro-reservation stance, and they.
A pro-reservation
stance, and saw this saw the suicides as sort of pathological, and they thought I was kind of celebrating or glorifying them.
So that this would generate too much empathy for those who are doing the suicides. Interesting. So you also wrote another political poem, and since we have time, I might ask you to read that too, that I liked, and of course you could maybe talk about some other work. This is fortnight after Diwali, because it references the Sikh riots, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we were very active. Manushi was very active, along with a lot of other groups and individuals. There was a huge outpouring of support for the Sikhs after the riots in Delhi, which has never been the case for Muslims.
Now,
because
these riots were post Indira Gandhi
assassination,
right?
And we were in Delhi. We saw the whole thing happen practically in front of our eyes. And one of our volunteers actually got killed in the aftermath of that. So it was written about that. It's called The Fortnight After Diwali, 1984. Never again will the arrow fly, flames rise, effigies crumble, crackers explode. Never the cries of children rend the air without this shadow leaping against the sky. How shall we light a candle but to illumine anguish and flight, these faces stricken? How play with fire but to awaken our night of shame? Where will the sun find tomorrow a street unwounded, place unmaimed? How shall we embrace, greet, smile? How shall we look into each other's eyes? Manushi was actually, the office was in a neighborhood which was half Sikh, half Hindu. So we actually saw, our landlords were Sikhs and we were very close to them. We saw the local Gurdwara being burnt, and Madhu tried to actually go, and she was always the one to put herself in the way of physical danger, and she tried to stop those rioters from burning the Gurdwara. But of course there was no way to stop them. So we actually saw all this happening.
This was in Lajpat Nagar, when you were in Lajpat Nagar?
It's a low middle to middle neighborhood.
And I think I interrupted you earlier. You were saying that that the response to the Sikh riots was very different than the response to the Muslim riots.
Yes, because Hindus and Sikhs hadn't had any history of being, they'd had a history of being allies and not of intermarrying, interdining, everything. Whereas Hindus and Muslims have had centuries of very fraught, conflicted history. So there have been so many Muslim Hindu riots where there is no great outpouring of public support. But for the Sikh riots, an unprecedented outpouring of support from very non-political people who came to help at the refugee camps. Huge range of people who had never before done any such thing. And when we went to Meerut, women's group from Manushi went to Meerut, and after the riots there in '87, and did a very detailed house-to-house report. We could see the sort of absolute walls of hatred between Hindus and Muslims. There's very little empathy or willingness to help each other. With the Sikhs there was, and that it got mended sooner. I think between Hindus and Sikhs now the relationship is much better than between Hindus and
But of course it was a different historical time, because the Muslim riots happened after Babri Masjid, most of them, so that there's that.
Not really. I think we forget that there's a whole history of it before. '87 was before. And there's a history dating back. I've looked at medieval sources even where there were riots over a Hindu procession passing a mosque and playing music, or over a cow slaughter and all this. This goes back really long, and of course it's convenient to say that it's post-colonial and it's post-Babri Masjid. That's certainly not. It has a really long, unfortunately long history. But with 6, it didn't, and that's why it was so shocking to people that this could happen.
Particularly in Delhi, which is so dominated by sort of Punjabi culture. So this is interesting because you said you wrote these between 90 and 93. So this was a retrospective poem about 1984? Or
No,
this
no,
one
no,
was
no.
this one
particular one was
written
at that
then.
time. No, I was writing throughout, but there was a sudden burst at that time.
There was another poem which I wonder if you could tell us about, and then before we go to some of your more the shorter love poems, that deals with, it's quite long, but maybe you could read an excerpt that deals with Siddharth, who he was and what the poem is trying to do. And
yeah, Siddharth Gautam was a young activist who was gay. He was a lawyer, and he died at the age of 27 of Hodgkin's disease. He was very active in ABVA, which brought out that little pamphlet, Less Than Gay.
Do you know what ABVA stands for?
Yeah, AIDS Bhedbhav Virodi Andolan, Anti-AIDS Discrimination Movement is how they translate it. And after his death, every year, these were some of the earliest gay events in India. We organized film festivals, and I was marginally active in those. We organized gay film festivals.
This was when?
In Delhi. He died in 92, so 93, 94, 95, every year there was one. They weren't called gay film festivals, they were called Siddharth Gautam film festivals, but almost all the films were about LGBT issues in some way. So it was a poem written when in memory of him when he died, and they used it in some of the publicity for one of the film festivals. Some of my poems also appeared in Manushi, even one poem about love between women did appear in an early issue of Manushi. So Manushi did publish some stuff on love between women intermittently.
And this was because you submitted them, or they got picked up?
Well, I
from
was
everywhere
working
else?
on it,
right.
and I put it in.
So could you maybe read a portion of this
Well,
poem?
okay.
And it's intertwined with another story, isn't it?
Yeah, the other story was of a young woman who was working as a domestic servant in the Miranda House teachers' apartments where I lived for some time, and she was a colleague's maid. And she was about 22. She was also around his age, and she was illiterate in a very different context, but also a different kind of victim. So it was about that. Well, here's a little bit about him. Doctors found names, found ways to give him a few more years, but he threw up wealth, career, and went in search of the right. The rights of women picked up without love, of men police pick up for roaming the hopeless streets, furtively groping for each other's hands, for the touch that may turn tender. He burnt himself out like a candle at both ends.
And there you're trying to make an explicit link between
prostitution and gay men cruising, because these are the groups that anti-AIDS groups work with. They always work with both groups of people because of transmission.
You have some other poems that I've liked to hear you read. Maybe you can talk about that. Has that been sort of that you can write those concurrently on political issues and more personal relationships?
Well, at that time when I was writing, I did. And even my academic work is very personal in the sense that now I'm writing about same-sex marriage. And I married in 2000 and then went to India and held a reception in the India International Center in Delhi, invited all my colleagues and my family, and there was a lot of tension and a lot of trouble about that within the family. My colleagues were wonderful about it.
Your colleagues here? Or there?
In Delhi. We married in New York, but we had a reception in Delhi the same year. So it is a personal issue in that sense. And then I've attended a wedding of Indian women in the US, and I'm writing about marriages there. So, you know, it's personal and political.
So while we're on this topic then, so the slogan, the personal is political, has been so central to American feminism. Do you feel it has valence in other contexts as well, such as when you were living in India and when you were coming out?
Yeah, I think it's very true, because if politics is about power, then it's about the power or the powerlessness that you experience. And certainly in the women's movement, I experienced certain kinds of empowerment as a woman. I did things that I wouldn't have done otherwise. I stayed out late at night on the streets getting work done and things like that. I traveled a lot. But there was another kind of disempowerment, because I wasn't empowered to speak about sexuality in the women's movement. I had to find another forum to do that, which I did. But so they were tied up very intimately.
Could you read to us from a selection?
Okay, this one is called Breakdown. Suddenly, without explanation, you withdraw like a power failure, neat, complete, irresistible. In a flash, I am blinded and grope for a candle to restore some shape. What comes to light lacks color, though, and, utterly without delight, just is. heat and stillness. Nothing moves but my shadow and the flame. Minutes burn away.
And this was?
These love poems were mostly about very different relationships with three women in those years. Actually, one was before, but the others were 90 to 94. And it was just my way of coping with the difficulties of those relationships. And almost all these poems, I didn't gender I kept the genders very uncertain, which a lot of homosexual poets have done through time. And it's ironic that one woman reviewer in India just assumed it was a woman writing to a man and thought it was a very male-dominated relationship and didn't like it.
So did you have to set her straight in public?
No,
or?
I didn't bother.
No?
It was just amusing.
Could you read to us from Rain too as well?
Okay. Too much of a good thing, rain drips slowly on. Day after day comes through the roof, spreads damply over walls, grows fur on books, hangs feeted in air, creeps aching moistly into back and limbs. No sun in the sky. Voltage dips and matches one by one refuse to light, drop dead. Fed up, I fall on the bed hoping for sleep. But oh, too soon ignited memory strikes your eyes, your hands, your lips against my dreams, sets skin alight. Words blaze, air crackles, flames flicker and spit, hiss then softly roar. Too hot to breathe. Come, my sun, my rain, my arbiter, steady this fire no weather can deter.
So you have reference there that recur is the weather, the monsoon.
Yeah, I was
heat.
living at the time in a room that was very damp and the water was destroying the books and coming through the walls, and matches really don't light there.
In the monsoon, nothing dries either, right? If we could just, while we're on this, you mentioned your marriage and the book that you're working on in terms of marriage in the US and India, same-sex marriage. In the US, it's such a contemporary hotspot right now politically. And some of the critique that's been coming up is from within the gay movement saying that, this isn't what, say, feminism fought for. This is sort of a conservative move to want to use marriage or claim the legality of marriage for same-sex partners. Do you think that sort of critique has the same meaning in India, or how do you, maybe I'm asking you to give you a preview of your book or an analysis, and that won't be...
Well, I think that critique only makes sense if you think of marriage as only an oppressive, only and always and everywhere an oppressive institution structured for the domination of women and children. And I think it has been that as well, and still is that in many places, in many marriages. But I don't think it's only that. I think marriage is also a way, has always been, even in Indian literature, you can see it in the earliest Indian texts, a way of declaring and publicly stating your commitment and your love. You can see it in Shakuntala, for example, where this woman just decides to marry this man without her father's permission. So it's a way of doing what you want to do, which is stating your love. And it has that power and that dimension, as is clear from these Indian women who marry each other in India and from the people who married each other in San Francisco. So it's also about that, and that of course has nothing to do with the state. But where the state comes in is that in India the state doesn't give as many privileges to married couples as they do here. Here they give huge number of privileges. So if they're going to give those privileges to married couples, then I think they should give them to married same-sex couples as well. Otherwise they should stop giving them to everyone, which they're not going to do. In India though, the state is less involved, and that's one of the things I'm writing about, that under Hindu marriage law, any two people who get married by a religious ceremony that is in one of their communities, they are considered legally married. They don't have to get a marriage license, they don't have to register it, and most people don't.
And that it doesn't even state the sex of, I think you've said
well,
this,
the
that
Hindu Marriage Act doesn't say man and woman anywhere. It says marriage of two Hindus, but then it goes on to use the terms bride and groom throughout. And in almost all of these cases, these women presented one as the bride and one as the groom. They actually use those terms. It's interesting because in the California case, the application form was changed to say applicant 1 and applicant 2 instead of bride and groom. And on that ground, it's now being challenged to say it wasn't a marriage because you changed the form. It doesn't say bride and groom. So it's interesting. I'm looking at the Hindu marriage law as distinct from the US marriage law, and how that plays out in terms of what the state's role is. And I think in India, the state's role is much less. The state doesn't even know how many people are married in India, because most people
don't have
never
to
register their marriage, right? So you don't know when they're married, they're divorced, they're remarried, what they're doing.
But if they choose to by civil law, what would the restrictions be?
Then some of those women have tried to. They've gone to the marriage registrar and tried to register it, and they've been refused in 2 or 3 cases. And that's very interesting. But I think if they filed a legal case and you had a really good lawyer, you could make a really good argument that one is the bride, one is the groom. The law doesn't say it has to be a man and a woman. The law says they have to marry according to the custom prevalent in one of their communities, which they did. They married in temples with priests, with families. So the community thinks it's according to the custom. The community has an important role in Indian marriage law, which it doesn't here. And so how can the state tell you it's not? So it could be fought, and I'm sure it will be. It just hasn't been fought.
And also, if the sort of inheritance laws get changed to be more progressive, to give partners rights upon the death of one partner, then that might make gay marriage even more important in India, right? That is to say that the avenue of marriage and civil unions as a way to guarantee.
Of course, I know many couples living in India who are virtually married. They've never had a ceremony, at least a public one, but they've lived together for over 2 decades. They've raised children together, and they are treated everywhere as a couple. So there's that.
Well, I wonder if you could sort of reflect a little bit on your life. No statement on, you know, what's to come, obviously, but in terms of where you are now, what honor, award, or achievement that you've received in the various awards and honors that you've received are you most sort of proud of and feel good about? Or
I think it's my work on same-sex love in India. The first book, Same-Sex Love in India, and the current book comes out of that, really. I think that's it, because I don't think at that moment, the way Salim and I did it, the focus on the primary sources, I think most other gay academics are focusing on the present, which is a very useful thing to do, but I think this wouldn't have been done for some time in exactly this way. And so I'm really glad we did that, and I'm happy about that. Yeah.
And what kind of personal impact has the work that you've been doing over the last couple of decades that we've been talking about, what sort of impact has it had on you? Obviously, you know, who you are and what you thought influenced what you did, but I'm sort of now asking the reverse. What, you know, if you think of now, how has the work that you've been doing influenced you? And where do you see yourself perhaps going in the future?
Well, it's enabled me to do many things that and make many moves and be mobile and live through many sort of very different circumstances, from being very Christian to being Marxist to being involved in the women's movement to working on lesbianism and gay issues. So it's taken me on this very interesting trajectory. And I've also lived through great historical moments. Like, who would have thought that the whole gay marriage issue would come up at this time, or the fall of the Soviet Union, just sort of very interesting historical moments. So, yeah, that's what I would say.
And is there anything else that you'd like to add to the interview that we haven't talked about?
No.
Any issues that you want to bring up, or?
No, I think we talked about
Like, I really want to thank you so much for sharing your work and giving us this time.
Thanks.
And thank you very much, Ruth, for coming today.
Bow to no man's word. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Bum bum ba dum bum 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 bum.